Welcome everybody to the Black Hole. This is going to be an evening where we shall be both entertained and enlightened. And it's going to be a kind of a sad evening. It deals with the partition of not just India and Pakistan, but also with four other partitions: Burma, Sri Lanka, uh, in the Middle East, well, going far as Dubai and Qatar and Oman. And this is not going to be the end of partitions. We all know there are going to be other partitions. And it is sad and depressing that humans choose to create partitions where they didn't exist, where they don't need to exist. There's a tendency among us, Homo sapiens, to imagine things. There's a wonderful book by Benedict Arnold. It's called Imagined Communities, which makes the seminal thesis that those people who think they belong to a community actually just know a handful of people, but they imagine that they know everybody in that community and that they have a link with that. And so in that process, India was divided, but then so many more parts of the earth have been divided, and what we have seen is enormous suffering. We must hear today what Sam Dalrymple has to tell us about this episode of history, while knowing that history is not yet complete. We don't know what will happen with the Durand Line, whether someday there is a new country over there, or things shall continue, or what will happen with Balochistan. Things change in ways that one cannot easily anticipate. And a lot of this has to do with technology. The very fact that there was a creation of a Hindu and Muslim identity goes as far back as 1870, when the British introduced the very first census. And you had to declare whether you were Hindu or you were Muslim, and that solidified identities. And today with maps, you can draw something, and the people who happen to live over there suddenly start to develop a notion that they belong there, that they have belonged for eons. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you Sam Dalrymple. He is a graduate of Oxford University, where he studied Sanskrit and India. He is also a filmmaker of great repute. And although he is just at the beginning of his career, I think he has a lot to tell us and a long way to go. So thank you, Sam, for coming here. And now we can go to your
lovely
slides. Yariye chala do.
Thank you, Dr. Hoodboy, for the lovely words. Can everyone hear me at the back here? Is this too loud or too soft? Brilliant. It's wonderful to be back here in one of my favorite cities, particularly with so many familiar faces. Aisha, who I worked on the Project Astan films with, is in the audience, as are several other old friends. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Which way do I point? One sec. There we go. I'd like to begin this evening with this image. There's this kind of rumor, I think, that we all grow up with, this kind of urban legend that you can see the Great Wall of China from space. And in fact, it's a complete myth. Even if you were to sit on the International Space Station and squint your eyes as hard as you can with 20/20 vision, you wouldn't be able to see a thing at all. In fact, there's only one wall visible from space, and that is the India-Pakistan border over here. This is Karachi on the bottom left, and there's Jaisalmer and Bikaner on the right-hand side. This is the most fortified wall on planet Earth that's ever been built. And it stretches 3,000 kilometers from the Arabian Sea right the way up to, the high Himalayas, where it turns into the line of control and eventually peters off near K2, the second highest point on planet Earth. And, obviously just this May, as a result of this wall, we came the closest, perhaps, that we've been in the 21st century to all-out war between nuclear powers. It was a very scary time, and I know everyone here felt it very deeply. What's extraordinary is that this is just one of many completely fortified borders in this region that didn't exist 100 years ago today. You go a bit further east, and the India-Bangladesh border is actually the longest wall in the world. It doesn't look like it on the map, but it wiggles and squiggles so much haphazard way across the Bengal Delta that there is more meters of wall there than any other wall on planet Earth, even longer than the US-Mexico border that Trump's currently building. And of course, you go a bit further than that and you reach the India-Myanmar border that is one of the largest borders currently under construction. And what's extraordinary is none of these borders not only didn't exist 100 years ago, but were even conceived of as potentially existing 100 years ago. If you go back 100 years to 1926, you would see a world that is completely unfamiliar in many ways. The Raj is still at its height in Kolkata. The Victoria Memorial has been opened. It's a kind of marble imitation of St. Paul's Cathedral, built out of the same stone as the Taj Mahal to kind of show that Britain has superseded the Mughals as the rulers of the subcontinent. And of course, in Delhi, you have Lutyens Delhi being built, the largest kind of architectural ensemble ever attempted by the British Empire. Although I think we talk about the 1920s often as the kind of road to independence, what's extraordinary is quite how unconceived, unbelievable it seemed to so many people at the time. There's this moment that is very famous in India, at least, the Declaration of Purna Swaraj, the Congress's first declaration that their aim would be complete national independence. And what's incredible is that in 1929, when this is made, or late 1928, it's not even the top news story. So this is the Taunton Courier that day, and bottom right you can see that the resolution affirming the goal of the Indian people was complete national independence was adopted. The far bigger story that day in the top left-hand corner of the paper is that the British Empire is planning to expand into space, and for the first time that day was trying to make contact with aliens. This is the top right-hand corner article, and you can see that the BBC turns its radio waves for the first time towards the stars. It says, "Hello, all stars and nebulae, a greeting to all friendly planets that circle with us on the everlasting tour. Do our waves reach you yet?" To which there's an awkward silence before they decide to turn the programming to addressing the people of India, who at that point constitute 4/5 of the British Empire and 1/4 of the world's population. And it's 1/4 of the population because India at the time, as it was legally defined in the Interpretation Act of 1886, was almost 2.5 times larger than the India we know today. And I think today we have this image of kind of pre-1947 India that includes Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that was divided in 1947. But the fact is that 100 years ago today, it was almost 1.5 times the size of that. This image, I think, demonstrates that rather brilliantly, because this is the Indian Empire passport of a Yemeni Jewish woman from Aden, in what's now South Yemen, who's trying to migrate to Jerusalem after the Balfour Declaration declares it a kind of homeland for the Jewish people. Now, by virtue of her being Yemeni, she is legally an Indian and thus has to travel on an Indian Empire passport. You can see there she's from the city of Aden. And I think that the fact that Aden was the westernmost point of India for almost 100 years has largely been forgotten. And that as a form of Indian national consciousness arose. The fact that Yemen produces several of the earliest Indian nationalists, and that several Yemenis perceived of a future where, Arab was an Indian ethnicity. it gets weirder, because many of you here will know that 1/3 of the Raj was governed indirectly as princely states. This is Chitral, Bhavalpur, Khairpur, Jodhpur, Jaipur, Hyderabad, Kashmir, etc. These semi-independent kingdoms that had given up their foreign policy, their communications, their defense to the Raj, but were internally rather independent and still recognized essentially as protectorates, sort of semi-independent states. What I think people don't realize is that on the official list of princely states, it's called the Alqabnama, it was issued every year by the Viceroy's office, is that this list opens with Abu Dhabi on the top left, and goes on to list other such princely states as Bhutan, Dubai, and Nepal. You can see these princes appearing at the Delhi Darbars if you go to Lord Curzon's house in England, you can see all the images of the Delhi Darbar, and you'll notice that there are all these princes from what's now Burma. And bottom right-hand corner is the Nizam of Hyderabad's elephant, trailed behind by the Sultan of Yemen, of Eastern Yemen's elephant. You put this together, and the map of 1920s India, as it was legally defined, is a surprising one. It's a gigantic swathe of humanity stretching from the city of Aden to the city of Rangoon. Red is directly ruled British India, and yellow is princely India. And this is how the Raj itself defined it. Of course, it varied in various places. Some of these places, the British had essentially kind of defined these into being part of the Raj, and actually there was very little British presence on the ground, for example, in Nagaland. But this is the stretch of land that was governed by the Viceroy of India, given the Indian passport, used the Indian rupee, guarded by the Indian army, governed by the Indian civil service or the Indian political service, and legally defined as Indian in international law. And the story that I'm going to be telling you over the next 40 minutes or so is the story of how between the 1920s and the 1970s, this one British Indian Empire passport. It was always regarded as an empire within an empire because of how many kind of protectorates were part of it. But how this one passport turns into 12 passports, how 12 modern nation states emerge through 5 partitions. These are Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. It's a much vaster story than I think we tend to realize, and one which I think explains so many of the great conflicts of our day. Everything, of course, Kashmir, Balochistan, Northeast India, the various insurgencies that continue to be active in these regions, but also civil wars in both Myanmar and Yemen, even Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in the Gulf War has its origins in these 5 partitions. And so that's the story I'm going to be telling you today. And it begins rather unexpectedly, I think, with what was once considered the largest and richest province of British India, and that was Burma. Burma has sort of fallen off, I think, the international radar, thanks to its kind of military rulers basically destroying its economy, pulling it out of the international system, and basically turning it into a sort of pariah state, this failed path, new path to socialism that turned it from one of the world's richest economies into one of the world's poorest. And yet, in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Rangoon overtakes New York City is the world's largest immigration and emigration port in the world. There are so many Punjabis, Bengalis, Tamils, Oriya speakers, basically people from across the Raj heading off in search of a better life in Rangoon, that it became one of the richest cities in the world. And it's still kind of vaguely there in the back of our subconsciousness. There's those songs like Mera Piya Ge Rangoon that kind of people vaguely remember, which is about kind of, the husband going off to make his fortune in Rangoon. But Burma never features in the stories we tell ourselves about the Raj and the path to independence. And yet you can see this incredible prosperity just by a short walk through downtown Rangoon, now Yangon, as I did in January. Within about 4 minutes, you pass the largest synagogue in Southeast Asia, the Tamil Hindu Bazaar, the Dargah of the Telugu community, and then finally the Armenian church. And yet, this massive wave of immigration that happens quite suddenly in the course of about 20 to 30 years creates a kind of backlash that I feel is kind of eerily reminiscent of Brexit to a certain extent. There's increasingly moves, people questioning whether Burma might be better off not independent from Britain, but independent from India as a separate British colony with the ability to control immigration into its borders. And increasingly there's debates about what it means to be Indian and what it means to be Burmese. And this is an article from The Scotsman, and it shows quite how kind of uncertain everyone was about this. They say that the attitude towards the separation question is one that strikes deep into the very existence of India itself as an entity. If one province breaks loose, no reason can be shown why similar claims by others should not be granted. And as we will see, the claims for all the subsequent partitions kind of begin here, and a set of dominoes goes off that begins here and ends with the creation of Pakistan. This question of whether Burma should be separated very much divides society down the middle. So on the one hand, you have this man, Mahatma Uttama. Uttama is the head of the local chapter of the Indian National Congress. He's from Arakan, but he's fluent in Urdu, he's fluent in Bangla, as well as Burmese. And he's a rather fascinating figure. He later becomes the head of the Hindu Mahasabha, the only Buddhist to fill the role, later replaced by the founder of Hindutva, Savarkar. And he spends the latter half of his career essentially arguing that Burma is an integral part of India. After all, Buddha's followers came from Bihar and brought Buddhism to Burma, and that these places have been connected by trade and by kind of a civilizational core since the beginning of known recorded history. Interestingly, it's actually his arch rival, or initial mentor but later rival, Mahatma Gandhi, after whom he gained the title Mahatma, who begins to push against him. And Gandhi says, no, the basis for the Indian nation that we want to create is not the contours of all the places conquered by the East India Company. He says that Britain has created this swathe of united territory from Yemen to Burma, but that's not the Indian nation I'm talking about. The Indian nation that I'm talking about, he says, is that of Bharatvarsh, the geographical contours of the Mahabharata epic, the ancient Hindu epic from kind of 2000 BC, that talks about this kind of Hindu homeland stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and the land beneath the Himalayas, essentially. But it's a world that does not include the Arab states and does not include Burma. And this all culminates in a massive series of events. Firstly, the Wall Street crash happens. A series of Tamil bankers begin seizing property. And in the wake of their seizure of property, there's a massive backlash, and everyone joins the separationists. On April Fool's Day 1937, the first partition of the Indian Empire occurs. Of course, there was the earlier partition of Bengal, but that did not create an international border. That divided one province into two provinces. This is the first time that the Indian Empire is being carved out so that a new international border forms. And I think that this fissure dividing Rangoon's Shwedagon Pagoda and the Taj Mahal is a good metaphor, in a sense, for the cultural alienation that's to follow. Because in the subsequent 5 years, an anti-immigration politicians take control in Burma. This guy called U Saw, who later assassinates Aung San Suu Kyi's father, leads a series of anti-Indian pogroms, basically pushing for the expulsion of all immigrants from the country. And this culminates when the Japanese invade in World War II. This culminates in what was then the largest forced migration that South Asia had ever seen. It's known as the Long March today, and 366,000 Indians flee Burma in the course of 1941 on the mountains, over the hills, on foot. In this kind of exodus that's somehow been written out of the collective memory. Today, you speak to people about Burma, and it's something to do with, oh yes, our family kind of lived there at some point and we learned how to make kaosui. But it doesn't go much deeper than that. But in fact, it was once regarded as absolutely integral to Indian identity. This photo, by the way, this man here is Uttam Singh, who I managed to interview in London. He later became the first Sikh model for Mosbros, the clothing company, and his son is now the PR guy behind Dishoom restaurant, if you've ever been to Dishoom in London. So this is the last photo taken of the Bordwin Sikh community in Burma before they're forced to flee. And they are just one group of 366,000 people. And of course, today we've got in Karachi, I think there's the Rangoonwala family who also did this journey. And I'm sure there was several people in the audience whose families made this trek. Now, around the same time as Burma's being separated off, this region's fate is also called into question. This was an area that had never been seen as particularly central to the Raj. It was all kind of protectorates and princely states. Only the city of Aden was under the direct rule of Bombay. The rest were kind of princes like the kind of, Sheikh of Dubai or the Sultan of Al-Qaiti, who had, like the Nawabs of Bahawalpur, pledged their allegiance to the Raj. It's actually as a result of that, by the way, that these states exist as separate from Saudi Arabia. It was the fact that they were under the Raj's protection, under the Indian Army's protection, which is why when Ibn Saud goes and unifies the tribes of Arabia in the wake of World War I, they don't push into any of these coastal states, and that's because they were under the Raj's protection at the time. So it's particularly after Lord Curzon comes in that he begins treating them not just as protectorates but as princely states proper. So all of the sheikhs and sultans get sent off to Mayo College, Rajasthan, which is the kind of Rajasthani equivalent of Aitchison, and so that the sultans of Oman for several generations are more fluent in Urdu than they are in Arabic. And in fact, Urdu remains the language of the Omani army until the 1960s. And there's all sorts of kind of crazy links like that. There's this family is the Al-Qaiti family. The Al-Qaiti family were the sultans of eastern Yemen, but they ruled eastern Yemen from the outskirts of Hyderabad in the Deccan. It's actually their family who invented the dish halim, which I'm sure everyone here knows, which was basically a Yemeni dish brought to the Deccan where they mixed it with Deccanese spices, creating the culinary masterpiece that we know today. But that emerges as a dish as a result of this this cultural world that exists as a part of parts of the Arabian Peninsula being annexed to India for 100 years. And here, and out of interest, this is the Nizam of Hyderabad with the sultans of eastern Yemen, who are all his relatives. And you can see that in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the formal dress of much of the Gulf region was not the kind of thobe and the outfits that we associate with the GCC today. It's actually Deccanese sherwanis that all of the elites are wearing, and often Kashmiri turbans as well. Now, remarkably, it's this extraordinary world is pulled apart at exactly the same time as the Burma separation. So the Indian government increasingly defines what they want the Indian colony to look like on the basis of this Hindu geography. And the Brits bizarrely actually offer up the Gulf to the future Indian government, and there's this quote that survives from the British legation in Tehran, which is that it was with surprising unanimity that the government of India officials told us that they had absolutely no interest in running the Persian Gulf states after we were gone. That is a quote. And so this whole region almost ends up as part of India, in which case it probably could have ended up as part of Pakistan, as Muslim majority region. But it doesn't, and that is because at the time the Indian government sees them as a drain on the exchequer that only makes sense being attached to India because of the fact that it was a useful refueling point between Suez and Bombay. This was Dubai, the year that it separated off. It's a very different image of Dubai than we see today. But there are several legacies. You have, for example, the Khimji family that is in Oman. They are the only Hindu sheikhs in the Arabian Peninsula. They are known as the Sheikhs al-Banyan, the Banya Sheikhs. And then, of course, there's this man, one of the richest men in Asia, Dhirubhai Ambani. His grandson had the crazy, massive wedding in Bombay last year. They are Gujaratis who had worked in the kind of Gulf Gujarat trade for generations. And when, during the rising Arab nationalist movement in the 1960s, many of many Gujaratis are kicked out of the Gulf. There's a brief moment when the Indian presence diminishes for a bit before then growing ever more. He hires the lot of them, and they form the origin of basically Reliance, which is today one of the largest companies in Asia. So these two events, the partition of Burma and the partition of the Arabian Peninsula from the Raj, could have been two of the central moments of 20th century Asia. And yet, they've almost been completely forgotten because I think the scale of what came next, the Great Partition of 1947, remains the central moment in both South Asian history, but it's one of the central moments in world history. It's the prism through which a quarter of the globe's population perceives their past, their present, their future. It remains the largest forced migration in human history. 10 to 15 million people left their homes between the years 1947 and 1949. 1 to 3 million people never made it. Now, I'm sure everyone here knows the whole story of the rise of the Pakistan demand. It's part of Pakistan studies in this country. But one of the things that I want to hammer home in this talk is the fact that the very first statement of intent to create a country entitled Pakistan, which is, of course, by Rahmat Ali Chaudhry in this pamphlet on the right-hand side, his justification in that pamphlet, the first pamphlet where the word Pakistan appears in print, is that it makes no sense to me why, if Burma is to be separated, then the Muslims of northwestern India must be forced into an Indian federation. So again, we today see this as slightly different, but these were all joint movements. In fact, the reason why the Myanmar government later turns on the Rohingya minority is because they were Pakistani nationalists. They were pushing for the establishment of Pakistan in what was now Arakan. And when that partition happens, they're cut off and perceived as basically separatists by the future Burmese government. So these are all kind of interrelated, in a sense. Of course, in August 1946, the struggle for the creation of Pakistan turns violent in the streets of Kolkata, in the day known as Direct Action Day. This is a photograph from that very first partition riot. And of course, very soon in the wake of this day, violence will spread out up the Gangetic Plains, off to East Bengal, so that by March 1947, Punjab itself declares into ethnic cleansing, with some of the worst violence occurring in this very district, in Rawalpindi district, where I think, the largest percentage of military soldiers had come to. And one of the reasons I think why Punjab sees so much more violence than anywhere else is because of the number of weapons and military men who are in the district. There are machine guns here in a way that they aren't available elsewhere. And that's because, of course, World War II had just occurred. And millions of soldiers are suddenly being demobilized. Now, the other thing that I want to hammer across here is quite how rushed it all was. From the declaration in June 1947, where Mountbatten announces on the radio that India is to be partitioned into two new dominions, India and Pakistan, divided along the basis of religion. What I think isn't emphasized enough is that Mountbatten had been given by British Prime Minister Clement Attlee a year and a half to carry out whatever he chose to do. He was given until June 1948 to stage a British withdrawal from the subcontinent. He announces the next day that he's going to try and do it in 77 days. By 14th, 15th August 1947. Why? Because it was the second anniversary of the Japanese defeat in World War II, and he thought it would make a nice round number to end the kind of post-World War II operations. And this rush leaves everyone in a panic. I think Shahid Hamid writes 77 days to create two new nations. There is no parallel in history. And this image is from the month before independence, and it's still unclear where India and Pakistan are going to be. And I think that isn't emphasized enough, that at that time, this is from the Hindustan Times, I believe, and they are not sure whether Delhi or Shimla or Lahore are going to be part of India or Pakistan. Kolkata, they think, are going to become part of Pakistan. Jinnah's original intention was actually for Kolkata to be Pakistan's capital city. He says that Pakistan without Kolkata would be like a man without his heart, which of course today feels completely absurd. And so begins the greatest bureaucratic nightmare in human history, because it's so rushed that that basically every minute or two, people need to divide rivers, stationary sets, the police force, the army, libraries, clubs, bits of surgery equipment from hospitals, etc. All needs to be divided between the two countries. This is a staged image by Margaret Book White, but it represents a very real process that happened, where libraries had to be divided between the two countries. When the dust settled 2 years later, it had emerged that all Encyclopedia Britannicas across the country had been divided alphabetically, so that A to K had all gone to India and J to Z had all gone to Pakistan. Such was the rush. Perhaps the most heinous example of this was with the Mohenjo-Daro necklace, perhaps the greatest masterpiece found from Mohenjo-Daro, the Indus Valley civilization, 5,300 years old. This was a golden thread with several semi-precious stones that all crucially came from outside the subcontinent, in a sense represented the ancient trade of the Indus Valley civilization with the rest of the world. There was lapis from Afghanistan, there was kind of jade from China, there was topaz from Egypt or something. And unsure of who should get the necklace, the bureaucrats decide to snip the 5,000-year-old necklace and give an equal number of beads to India and an equal number of beads to Pakistan, so that today you can actually see a pile of beads sitting in both the National Museum in Karachi and in Delhi. Neither have a sign telling you what these beads were once part of. There is no image telling you that these were once part of one of the great masterpieces of Harappan civilization. And of course, so begins amidst the uncertainty, amidst the fact that no one knew until 3 days after independence which country places like Lahore were going to belong to. So begins the largest forced migration in human history. I've already told you that the number of deaths, and this is the famous photograph again by Margaret Book White from that great migration. And of course, it's a migration that lives with us, lives with us today. I'm sure that over 2/3, maybe 3/4 of the people in this audience will have family who migrated across this line. It remains the central feature of South Asian politics, and the furies unleashed during the Great Partition remain a kind of, a hindrance to any India-Pakistan peace. Obviously, it's the origin of the whole fight over Kashmir and everything that's followed, all of the wars. Speaking of Kashmir, what I call the fourth partition of the Indian Empire is the fact that when Cyril Radcliffe, the British lawyer who'd never been east of Paris, is assigned to divide the Raj on the basis of religion, he's only charged with dividing British India. He's not charged with deciding the fate of the princely states. So that this is actually what Pakistan looks like on Independence Day. And you can't quite see on this screen India, but India is full of holes where all the princely states had been. It is, you can actually see this image on the front cover of newspapers like the Hindustan Times, like Dawn. The Independence Day special has images of a map that is completely different to the map that we are used to seeing today. And although I think the Radcliffe line is an apt name for the border of India and Bangladesh, which Cyril Radcliffe essentially drew, he only divided the Punjab bit of the India-Pakistan border, and the rest were determined by 8 princely states that lay in the borderlands, whose decisions to choose one state or the other determined where the border would fall. These are the princely states. And obviously today, the border runs through this yellow mass here and along the lines over here. But this was not a given, and fascinatingly, of the 20-odd border states that bordered both countries, the only one to announce in advance of time which country it wanted to join was Bikaner in what's now Rajasthan. But Jodhpur, Jaisalmer, Bhavalpur, Khairpur, Kutch, the Khasi states, Tripura, Kuch Bihar, all of these states basically spoke to both sides and asked what was the best deal that they could get. So Bhavalpur is in negotiations with Nehru until very late to see what happens if it joins India. Jodhpur, the blue city of Rajasthan, and Jaisalmer both enter negotiations with Jinnah to see what they could get if they joined Pakistan. The Khasi states in what's now Meghalaya, north of Bangladesh, actually do try to join Pakistan. And there's Yaqub Bangash, who helped organize this talk, found incredible series of files which show that they tried to accede to Pakistan, never heard a response, and 3 months later, after sending letter after letter saying, please, can we join Pakistan, they decide to join India instead because of the fact that they don't hear back. And so I think it talks about how not random, but how contingent so many of the borders that we see today really are. Here are the princes looking absolutely fantastic in the Durbar with all of their outfits. And there are three major conflicts that I think break out in the wake of the partition of the princes. The first, of course, is Hyderabad. Hyderabad is the Deccan in central India, ruled by a Muslim Nizam, who was at the time the richest man on the planet. But it had an enormous Hindu majority. It was also incredibly feudal, and he tries to go independent, but a communist revolution breaks out in the countryside. The Nizam is forced to rely increasingly on a Muslim paramilitary group called the Razakars to basically put down the communists, who increasingly, in addition to putting down the communist threat, also begin burning Hindu temples, etc. So soon a complete civil war breaks out in the state, and eventually the Indian army just goes in September 1948, the week that Jinnah passes away. So often you hear that partition is a story that occurs in Punjab and Bengal, but I think it's important to remember that there is 3 times more migration from Hyderabad state in the year 1948 than occurred during the Palestinian Nakba the same year. It's an enormous scale of displacement that isn't usually placed placed in the history books in the scale that it should be. It's the it's the province of the former Raj that saw the third most amount of displacement. And obviously today you can go to Karachi and there's whole neighborhoods of Hyderabadi Muhajirs. The second state, of course, that emerges, that sees violence as a result of this partition is Balochistan, which was the Khanate of Kalat. The Khan, like Hyderabad, had initially intended to go independent. And initially it seems that Jinnah went along with the plan, essentially. But as I lay out in the book, there's a series of events that eventually pressure him into joining Pakistan, but not after the Kalat parliament, because it was a constitutional monarchy, essentially. Not after the Kalat parliament had already voted to try and remain independent. And so begins this tussle over independence or joining Pakistan that continues to this day and continues to bring huge violence upon Balochistan to this day. And then, of course, there's Kashmir, a enormously Muslim majority princely state, but that had vast Hindu, Sikh, and Buddhist populations in various pockets. The recent scholarship on Kashmir is rather fascinating because it shows that the Maharaja of Kashmir had initially wanted also to go independent, as so many princely states did. And I think all of the nationalist narratives in South Asia, be it India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or even Britain, brush over quite how many of the princely states had intended to just go independent and not join either state. Crucially, Nepal and Bhutan had put forward a legal petition the previous year, basically demanding that Himalayan states be allowed to remain independent because of the fact that Himalayan states had separate cultures and not be forced into either union. And it seems that the Maharaja of Kashmir's initial attempt to go independent essentially emerges from that. There's just been a legal thing that's shown that Himalayan states can legally choose independence if they wish. But a series of Punjabi pogroms spread into the city of Jammu, leaving huge numbers of Jammu Muslims dead or fleeing to what's now AJK. In the wake of the Jammu massacres, a series of officers in the Pakistani army go actually behind the back of Jinnah to sponsor the famous Lashkar to try and capture Kashmir and get it to join Pakistan by force. The Maharaja of Kashmir, in turn, when hearing of this Lashkar approaching Srinagar, flies down to Delhi, hands over the accession. And so very quickly you have the Indian army and the Pakistani army fighting in the high Himalayan passes. Of course, the great tragedy at this juncture, long before any of the great violence of the 90s and the horrors that have been sown upon Kashmir ever since. The great tragedy in 1948, I think, is that the soldiers fighting each other for the very first time had been fighting for each other's lives for World War II just 2 years earlier. And one of the saddest stories that I heard is that there was a unspoken rule that if anyone lobbed a packet of cigarettes across the front line, it would contain letters to old officer friends from the other side of the war so that they could check in on their friends who they were ordered to shoot. And they had been risking their lives for one another on the Burma front, on the fields of Iraq, just months earlier. And, you know, this is something that I think continues until 1971. I think Kargil War is actually the first one where the majority of officers did not know each other from World War II. And I think so often that closeness gets lost in the narratives that we tell of this war. And of course, today, Kashmir is the former state of Jammu and Kashmir, as it was governed by the Dogra dynasty, is of course today divided between India, Pakistan, and China. Now, of course, by 1949, with the ceasefire that occurs in Kashmir, the map of South Asia that we are used to, more or less, comes into effect. This is the map, the official map of Pakistan at the time, of course showing Junagadh. Some of you will know that Junagadh had tried to join Pakistan as well, and it appears on the early maps of Pakistan. And of course the only difference to the map that we see today is the fact that where we see Bangladesh today, it then read East Pakistan. I think so often people look back and talk about how you know, a certain amount of inevitability that, you know, these two wings separated by thousands of kilometers could never have made it work. But from what I see, that wasn't necessarily the case. Despite these early fights, 4 out of the first 8 Pakistani prime ministers are of Bengali heritage. And of course, this is the coins of Pakistan back in the day with Bangla and Urdu written both. Here's Khwaja Nazimuddin, who I think is the first Bangla prime minister of Pakistan. But of course, everything changes with Iskandar Mirza's coup in the late 50s. And the crucial factor here is that only 2% of the Pakistani military at the time came from Bengal. And so unlike the political class, which was pretty evenly divided across both, you essentially, with the first military coup, you have the entirety of Bengal's upper elites sort of pushed out of power overnight, and very quickly you have you know, columns appearing in the press saying that it feels like imperialism never ended. We feel like a colony of West Pakistan, which never appears really that much in the 1950s. And of course, these grievances find a voice in this man over here, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Who, of course, I'm sure everyone knows the story, the Agartala conspiracy case. His what is fascinating is the increased number of intelligence files that have recently been declassified in the last basically 7 years, which have in a sense revealed an entirely new narrative of how of Mujib's early contacts with Indian intelligence, what exactly that was. There's a brilliant book that I'd recommend to everyone in this room called India's Near East by Avinash Paliwal, which is the first book to really utilize these new files. And in a sense, they change so many of the received narratives that we hear. And it's a reminder of how much history can change as new sources are released into the public. Ultimately, after the 1970 elections, as everyone knows, the military refuses to hand over power to Mujib's party, the Awami League. There is a crackdown in Dhaka known as Operation Searchlight. And in the course of the subsequent year, as Awami Leaguers are increasingly targeted, and astonishingly 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians becomes a refugee. This is the UN statistic. So although it remains unclear the death toll, there are a number of numbers being shunted around, none of which seem to have any particular basis. There's no census that occurred, no real way that we can truly know the death toll in the course of 1971. We do know that 1 in 12 Pakistani civilians becomes a refugee in either India or Burma or West Pakistan that year. Which is astonishing. And of course, by December 1971, the Third Indo-Pak War breaks out as India increasingly begins backing the Mukti Bahini, the kind of Bengali independence army, essentially. And although they first seemed to extend monetary support right from the beginning, right from within about 2 or 3 weeks after the crackdown, and again, more and more documents have been released to the public which allow us much more scrutiny onto exactly what happens. It's only in November and December that all-out war breaks out. And of course, with this image, they are signing into existence Bangladesh as the 12th nation state to emerge from what had once been the Indian Empire. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So
that was brilliant, and a lot of people will have questions. My request is that you do not ask until the mic gets to you, because this is being broadcast live.
Do we have the microphone that we can pass around? Here we go. Yes. There you go.
Hi. Thank you for sharing. And I was reading your book as well. So my question is about Abu Dhabi and Nepal and like other protectorate states. So like, why doesn't the separation, or why doesn't the that they were colonized, that exist in the public memory? Or like we talk about the other colonizations, but not that. So maybe something on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So firstly, with both Nepal and Oman, within the Al-Qabnama, the list of princely states that I talked about, they were always regarded as rather specially different. So unlike Dubai, that was very much a straightforward princely state, both Oman and Nepal were considered independent states under the protection of the viceroy, which was a weird legalese for basically what a lot of scholars refer to as informal princely states. They were not legally part of this thing, but the Indian political service was there all the same. The rest of the functionalities of the Raj was there all the same, despite legally them not meant to be being there. Within Dubai and Bhutan and Yemen, it is rather fascinating. I think that by and large, one of the reasons is the rise of area studies. So during World War II, a series of like the world was basically divided into various geographies depending on South Asian Command, Southeast Asian Command, the different battles that were going on in World War II. And the words Middle East, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, which essentially cut across what had once been the Indian Empire, had never really existed before World War II, and yet become these standard words, particularly during the Cold War. So that today, basically, all these histories are studied by different faculties and different universities who study different languages. When Tant Min Oo, who is one of the great scholars of Burma, visits Delhi about, I think it's 2011. He writes in his brilliant book on Burma and Indian heritage. It's called Where India Meets China. He writes that with surprise about the fact that today there is not a single Burmese department in any Indian university. And so despite the fact that everyone in Burma is aware of this history, it never gets taught in India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh. Likewise, in Yemen, bizarrely, people are very aware of this history. You go to Aden, and in Aden, everyone is aware of the fact that they had been the westernmost city of India for years. And, you know, Qayati state in what's now the Hadramaut region of Yemen, you know, it's very much, you can go to the museums there and it talks about this having been part of Hyderabad state in the Deccan. But somehow, because the Arab world has since been, I think one of the big reasons is the rise of Arab nationalism, which in the 1960s rewrote a lot of the histories of the Gulf. And so even citizenship, for example, was rewritten so that you couldn't get citizenship in many of the Gulf states unless you were an Arab who spoke good Arabic. And so despite the fact that many of these Gujarati or Sindhi or Balochi families had been living there for generations, they had to be good at Arabic and claim some sort of Arab heritage if they wanted citizenship. So today you do have certain Arab communities there, but whose surnames sort of give away their origins. For example, the Al-Baluchi tribe of Oman and Bahrain, etc. And, you know, it does show up occasionally in the textbook. So I think a lot of Balochis, again, are aware of the fact that Gwadar was under Omani sovereignty right into the 1950s. That's another thing that I talk about at length in the book. But yeah, thank you for that question. It's a funny one. But I think one of the key reasons is that whilst there was a moment that Indian nationalism did begin being vocalized in Yemen and in Burma, etc., particularly in places like Dubai, the princely states never really sort of adopted Indian nationalism in any real way. Even if you asked anyone in there in the 1920s what sort of identity they had, no one would have said we're Indian. They'll said they're Khaliji. Only a few elites who were studying in Aitchison or Mayo would have said, yes, we feel increasingly Indian, despite the fact that legally they were Indian. But, you know, there's a difference between what your legal identity is and what you feel in your heart. But yeah, thank you for that question. Any more questions? Yes, there's a lady in the front.
You see, the whole concept of partition as proposed by Jinnah was on the basis of religion. That Muslims and Hindus cannot coexist peacefully. Therefore, the very fact that, all these Muslim majority princely states like Dubai, Oman, and Bahrain and Kuwait, for them, the main identity was their own nationalism, which was aligned to them being Arab. And that was a rejection of this concept of the primary identity being based on the basis of religion.
Sure. Continue.
So my question to you is that the basic foundation for the creation of Pakistan, that Hindus and Muslims cannot coexist. And also in addition to that, all the princely states were supposed to make their own decisions whether to join India and Pakistan. Look at the example of Junagadh, for example, being a Muslim majority, but surrounded by India on all sides. Likewise, Bangladesh, East Pakistan, surrounded by India. So, areas which were not even contiguous. So, how is this accepted, this formula accepted by leaders like Nehru and Jinnah, that the princely states should decide on their own what to do? And there were more than 500 of them. So that sort of, I'm amazed at the wisdom of our leaders. Yeah.
No, so I think, it's important to remember that Jinnah himself was, so Patel, who was kind of Nehru's right-hand man, was very certain that the princely states should not be allowed to choose their own future and should be kind of forced at hand and fist. And he was a big fan of arm twisting and all sorts of kind of underhand deals. Whereas Jinnah very much pushed for the recognition that kind of, princely states should be allowed to decide their own fates. And I think he was very much into, self-determination in that sense. I think that one of the things about Jinnah that comes across in the archives is how gradually he comes to the idea of Pakistan as it is today. I think it's what's interesting is how the early idea of Pakistan as envisioned by Jinnah is quite different and seems to be much more in line with what the cabinet mission plan proposed. He's a constitutional lawyer who worked in Britain for the longest time, and when he talks about the establishment of nations and of states, but not nation states, I think he's looking at basically the situation of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland within Britain. He crucially never gives up his house in Bombay because he thinks he's going to be able to move back and forth. His daughter remains in Bombay. Dina never moves here. And so I think that all of this is part of the fact that the Pakistan as envisioned by him was more of a kind of Scotland as opposed to England. This idea that I think it wasn't so much that Hindus and Muslims couldn't get along, so much as that Muslims needed constitutional guards to protect them against an overwhelmingly larger majority. He had very much, I'm sure everyone knows the kind of hostage theory, the idea that, he never expected anyone to migrate. He expected that, Punjab's Hindu and Sikh population would stay in situ and that they could be used as a kind of guarantor of the Muslims in UP, etc. And so I think that it's important to remember quite how different the Pakistan that emerged was from the initial vision that Jinnah had in the late 1930s, early 1940s. Thank you for that question. Any more?
I wanted to add something.
Where are we? Hello. Yes. Hi.
I just wanted to add something about, there was this, I was researching in the British archives and I found a gazette from the 1920s that mentioned that the Lahore High Court, it was a proclamation by the King Emperor that the Lahore High Court would have jurisdiction even over Kashgar, and that continued till 1942. I believe. I think it was under the Foreign Jurisdiction Act of 1890 that proclamation was made. But my question was about Ceylon. Why was Sri Lanka not considered part of India while Yemen was like,
Um,
even though it gained independence in 1948.
No, so this is one of the great surprises, I think, and things that people find surprising, is that Ceylon. So the way that the Indian Empire, as it was known, was formed was basically random places taken over by the East India Company that basically travelled along old trade routes, kind of annexing places that traded with one another. This included many places that never ended up as part of the Indian Empire: Ceylon, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, even parts of Somaliland and Iraq and various other bits. Sorry, not Iraq, but Somaliland. And but in 1798, Ceylon is separated off from the rest of the East India Company's territories and made into a separate crown colony earlier than the nationalization of the rest of the Raj. And so it becomes a separate entity much earlier. But it's never much of an issue, of course, until that boundary becomes an international boundary in the wake of 1947-48, when, of course, Tamils end up trapped between the two and the Sri Lankan Civil War emerges as a result. The other places like Somaliland, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia do actually end up as part of the Raj after the nationalization of the East India Company in 1858, but I think they are separated off within 1 or 2 years. And crucially, they're separated off before the Interpretation Act, which defines who's Indian and who's not, and before the issuance of the first Indian passports. So you would never have someone sitting in Sri Lanka or indeed Singapore and these other territories that were conquered by the East India Company holding that Indian Empire passport that I showed at the beginning. Whereas remarkably, Yemenis did, and Burmese people did, but somehow Sri Lankans did not. But yeah, thank you for that question. And regarding Kashgar, actually, my friend Narayani Basu is working on exactly this. There are all sorts of territories, such as Afghanistan, such as Tibet, such as Kashgar, even such as bits of Thailand at various points, that at various points fall under the kind of circular influence of the Raj, but they are never legally defined as part of the Raj. And so, perhaps the most obvious one was the oil refinery in Abadan in southern, the Anglo-Persian oil company that's later nationalized by Mossadegh in Iran, that, leads to that coup that then, everyone knows the story. That was in effect run as a kind of joint operation by Burma Oil, based in Burma, and the Raj. And so to this day, you can go to Abadan, and there's a mosque known as the Masjid-e-Ranguniha, the mosque of the Rangunians, because it was built for the Muslim community of Rangoon. And it's this amazing mosque that's very clearly not Persian in style. There's no influence from the Safavids, etc. It's a Mughal style. It's a Bengali / Burmese style mosque built in the middle of Iran for East India Company and then later Raj officials to pray at. And so, yeah, there are all of these other places where the Raj's tentacles get into, but they were never legally defined as protectorates in the same way as this region was. But thank you for that question. Is there any more questions? Yes, someone at the back with the brown jumper. Can we pass the microphone back? Oh, or if the lady, yeah, if you want to, sorry.
Hi.
And then the brown jumper afterwards, please.
Hi. So more than a question, I just wanted to congratulate you. This is a fascinating work of history. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Without giving too much away, I wanted to ask you of Mr. Noon, the Prime Minister, his role with Gwadar and the letter that ended democracy.
Yes.
That was fascinating.
Yeah, sure. So Feroz Khan Noon is today, I don't think, one of the most spoken about Pakistani prime ministers, but I think this is rather, or leaders in fact, but I think this is rather ironic in a sense, because of the fact that he's the only leader of Pakistan other than Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan, so one of the 3 leaders, to have ensured the geographical increase of Pakistan's territory. Not only does he negotiate the entry of Gwadar into the Pakistani Union, he also resolves border disputes with both Iran and between East Pakistan and India all of which ensure that Pakistan has a larger amount of territory than when it started. And so he's a rather extraordinary figure, and one who, because of the fact that he's the one who's cooed by Iskandar Mirza, and then Ayub Khan takes over later, is lesser spoken about. I did a lot of the research on that particular section. There's a whole story that sort of got popular online about his wife, Vicaranissa, playing an important role with the Gwadar thing that turns out to be complete nonsense. It emerges from one random interview about kind of 10 years ago and seems to have very little basis of fact. If you've ever read a thing about his wife getting involved, there is remarkably little research on the Gwadar introduction, but I stayed in their house and was looking through their archives for a while, which is an incredible resource for scholars. And yeah, among these incredible documents detailing the day-to-day negotiations for Gwadar's entry into the Union, the pressuring of the Omani government, the potentially cutting off funds, this moment where they nearly go to war, as well as the kind of knocking down of border posts and all sorts of kind of, underhand stuff. There's also a rather extraordinary document that I think you were referring to, which is the document that he receives from Iskandar Mirza, which reads something along the lines of, my dear Sir Firuz, my greatest greetings to you. I'm so sorry though, but I must abrogate democracy, end all parliamentary proceedings. And it's the kind of most polite letter that you've ever read, and it ends with kind of, my only misery is the fact that you of all people were the person I had to do this to. I have such fondness for you, and we must hang out sometime. After which, kind of, Sir Noon's response, Prime Minister Noon's response, is equally polite, and it's kind of the politest coup in world history. And I don't think any of the subsequent coups in any of South Asia's countries have been nearly as polite, because Noon responds, "My dear Iskandar Mirza, I was so overjoyed to read your letter. I completely understand that you must end democracy, abrogate parliamentary proceedings, and institute martial law. My only disagreement is that you were the person to do this to me. I must take up your offer to kind of hang out sometime soon." And it's the kind of weirdest, which I just can't imagine happening again. And it speaks about that time and the kind of social etiquette of the time. But I think it's definitely one of the more surreal letters that I've ever read. But yeah, so all the documents are there, and I think they're trying to do something with this archive, opening it up to more scholars. Half of their archive is in Nurpur Noon and half is in Lahore, but they're in the process of trying to set up something to make it more readily available to scholars who want to study this rather enormous change that occurred in Firuz Khan Noon's prime ministership. But yeah, thank you for that question. Someone else? Yes, Matt. We had. Okay. Yes.
Great talk, Sam. I wanted to ask you about Great Calcutta killings. You mentioned that,
Yeah.
and Pakistanis blame Indians, and Indians blame Muslim League.
Yeah.
So who do you think started it?
So there's great question, and it's one that please can we pass the microphone to the man in the brown jumper, because he's had his hand up for a while, but the Great Calcutta killings, the first partition violence. It's of course freighted with immense meaning, because whoever is responsible for those killings is by virtue kind of partially responsible for everything, all the dominoes that fell subsequently. There was no guarantee that the division of this land had to lead to the scale of the massacres that subsequently emerged, and certainly that didn't occur with any of the other partitions in the same way and as suddenly. What's fascinating, and the recent scholarship, I think the best work on them has been done by Janam Mukherjee in his work Hungry Bengal, and what he argues is that Suhrawardy was basically, giving all sorts of incendiary speeches, but was in a sense he'd expected when, that whole thing of whether the Lahore Resolution was about independent states and Eastern and West Pakistan as separate or as part of one state. So he was trying to organize this demonstration on a larger scale than elsewhere, but it doesn't seem to have had any orders to kind of, massacre anyone. Certainly that didn't occur in any other province, despite the fact that Direct Action Day was held in every city across the country. It only occurs in Kolkata. Why is this? And Janam Mukherjee's argument, which I find persuasive, is that there was this growing sense that there was about to be a big showdown. Paramilitary groups were growing rapidly, notably the RSS, the Muslim League National Guards, several others like the Kaksars. There were all these groups that had emerged essentially a bit like the Boy Scouts, but had, in the course of World War II, got increasingly militarized, and in the lead up to Direction Day had begun teaching people self-defense, wandering on with lathis, but then also tapped into the post-World War II black market trade in weapons that was floating around. Now, what seems to have happened is that it wasn't necessarily instigated by either side, the first bit of violence that day, and that it seems to have been much more to do with hungry Bengalis. The Bengal famine that occurs in 1943 still has not completely disappeared by 1946, and it didn't just last 8 months, it lasts 3 years. And the first documented bit of violence that day actually occurs a bit before Suhrawardy's speech, and is a series of hungry Bengalis trying to break into a food bank. But in that incredibly tense environment where everyone was armed to the teeth, basically it was a bunch of hungry Muslims who were trying to break into a food bank that had been guarded by Hindus. And everyone had been convinced that there was about to be a bit of violence that day, and that seems to have shot off the first bit of violence. They were convinced that it was Muslims trying to attack Hindus, when and a mob sort of comes to deal mob justice in this random part of Kolkata on this crucial thing. So tragically, the first bit of partition violence seems to be very intimately tied with the Bengal famine, which of course is another great tragedy that emerges in World War II. Around 3 million individuals are left dead thanks to this moment, so that it's the year 1943 that sees the least fighting of the British Empire, actually sees the most casualties, civilian casualties in World War II as a result of this famine. But it seems that the first bit of active murder in the lead up to partition is a direct result of the Bengal famine, and it's a very recent bit of research, but it's fascinating. But thank you for that question. Who's been waiting patiently at the back.
Thank you. Sam, first of all, congratulations on the book and its success, and congratulations on the wonderful jacket that you're wearing and carrying off.
Thank you. From Lahore.
Yeah. So, like you just mentioned about the Direct Action Day and how the tinderbox was lit, what were the almost partitions that you think could have happened and were almost hurtling towards? And if indeed the whole of the British Empire had been partitioned along princely state lines and there was a number of small nation states, going into a bit of speculation here, what do you think the subcontinent would have looked like geopolitically, in terms of violence, in terms of its relationship with Russia, the Afghanistan situation, China? Because this is a
big question.
There's a lot of what ifs. That what if this could have happened or that could have happened? So a balkanized subcontinent, what do you think that would have looked like? And was there a chance of that happening?
So there was, and Jinnah, Nehru and Aung San, who's the founding father of Burma, all separately talk about their aim essentially being a United States of South Asia, and they see some. I think it's what's his name who founds the phrase "Inqilab Zindabad," one of the great Muslim League, Hasrat Mohani. He imagined South Asia's future as being similar to the SSRs of the Soviet Union. And he imagined, just like there's a Tajik SSR and a Ukrainian SSR and a kind of, a Kazakhstani SSR, so South Asia would turn into that kind of thing. And he actually resigns from the Muslim League, despite having been one of its strongest campaigners for the creation of Pakistan. He resigns when it's clear that it's not going to be that sort of system and that it's going to be a separate nation state. And I think that that's it's fascinating how many Muslim Leaguers resign as a result of learning that it's going to be a nation state rather than an SSR style system. And it shows how different the kind of idea that people were fighting for was from the moth-eaten Pakistan that was received. I'm not sure. So I can definitely talk about the other nationalisms that existed. There are a huge number of alternative nation states that are proposed in those years that very rarely get spoken about. So, of course, there are the ones that continue to have insurgencies, many of which are the result of these early nationalisms that also almost come to fruition. You've got, Nagas in the 1940s talking about an independent Nagaland. You have Kashmiris talking about an independent Kashmir. You have Balochis talking about an independent Kalat. You have Hyderabad talking about an independent Deccan. There's all sorts of these. In addition to that, I think if you chatted to anyone in the 1920s, they would have imagined the likelihood of an independent Dravidian state, a South Indian state, being far more likely than an independent Muslim state, and certainly far more likely than an independent Bengal. I think one of the reasons for so much tension in South Asia is the fact that none of the countries involved really got the nation that they had been imagining in the years leading up to its creation. Bengal, the Bengali state today does not include Bengal's capital or any of the historic capitals. Not only Kolkata, but it doesn't include Murshidabad, it doesn't include Gaur, and it doesn't include Pandua. Likewise, India, where nationalists had imagined this state that resembled the Mahabharata, doesn't get Sindh or Bangladesh or Kashmir. And likewise, Pakistan does not get the entirety of Kashmir, and it doesn't get Delhi even. And Delhi was, of course, one of the cities that Pakistani nationalists had most expected to fall as part of Pakistan, as the seat of Islam in the subcontinent for thousands of years. So what could it have looked like? I think that with princely states, the smaller princely states, the princely states ranged, and this is very important to recognize. The princely states ranged from basically estates that were a couple of kilometers long. There is one princely state called Vajanones, which I think had a population of about 50, and there's one photograph with the entire state population in a single photograph, so hardly the basis for an internationally recognized state. But then Hyderabad was larger than France, as was Kashmir, and Hyderabad had a larger economy than Belgium's, and indeed 20 UN nation states at the time. Its ruler was the richest man in the world, and it's important to remember that when the last Ottoman caliph, after he's deposed, is trying to marry off his daughters in the wake of World War I, he doesn't choose to marry them to the Shah of Iran's sons. He doesn't try to marry them to the Saudis or to the Iraqis or to the Egyptians or any of the other monarchies that exist across the Islamic world at the time. He chooses to marry them to the Nizam of Hyderabad's family because they are considered the most important Muslim rulers in the world, other than the Ottoman Caliph. And that's a whole world that's been forgotten today. So I think, although some of the smaller princely states would never have survived on their own, you would have ended up with some sort of united federation or something possibly a bit like Malaysia, for example, which is a similar system, right? There are a series of sultans that share power in some sort of way that emerges from a similar kind of British Empire system. It's impossible to imagine how that pie could have been cut because there are so many different ways that it could have. But I think it's a reminder of how contingent the borders that we have inherited today really are. But yeah, thank you for the question. I think we may have one or two more questions, and then yeah. Hello.
First of all, really inspired by your research and knowledge on the subcontinent and the other areas. My question is regarding Kashmir. How do you analyze the role of Radcliffe and his aides in the creating the Kashmir dispute as it is today, which has affected the whole region, especially with reference to Gurdaspur, Firozpur, and Amritsar?
Brilliant. Yeah.
One second question is, you mentioned about Yemen. I have read in BBC site that UAE and Oman were also possibly joining Pakistan or India in 1947.
Yeah.
They were given the choice, but they denied.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the second half is very much part of the book, and I go into it in depth. The Kashmir thing. So I don't think Radcliffe himself is the one who made the decision about Gurdaspur, etc. He's the one who's given orders, and his orders are quite explicit. Radcliffe, I think, is essentially a bureaucrat who's brought in to carry out the work, and it's actually kind of, you can blame Mountbatten and the ones who are actually giving the orders, I think, far more than Radcliffe, who was suggested by Jinnah as a potential unbiased arbitrator because of the fact that he'd never been east of Paris and thus wouldn't know any congressmen or Muslim leaguers, and thus that might make him a potential unbiased arbitrator. He is given the task of dividing along the basis of religious majority-minority districts, but he also is asked to, he's given several other conditions. He needs to make it such that they are viable states, so that he needs to take into account the distribution of holy places, specifically places like, for example, Amritsar need to be in India. And although, of course, Nankana Sahib, the birthplace of Nanak, ends up in Pakistan. But in addition to that, he needs to make sure, and he's given quite explicit instructions, he needs to make sure that Kashmir has the ability to choose which country it joins. And the only way of doing that was making Gurdaspur part of Pakistan. It's not the only kind of, state district whose majority-minority status was played around with, in a sense, and given to the wrong country. In the India-Bangladesh borderlands, you've got the Chittagong Hill Tracts that ended up as part of Pakistan. They were 2% Muslim, majority Buddhist, and they bordered Burma. And they were the victims of basically two partitions. First, not ending up as part of Burma, and then secondly, not ending up as part of India. They were given to Pakistan on the basis that East Pakistan's greatest port of Chittagong needed a hinterland and needed control of its own water resources. And as a result, the poor people of the Chittagong Hill Tracts have been made to suffer ever since. Murshidabad, the great ancient seat of Murshidabad district, has all the ancient capitals of Bengal in it, ends up as part of India, despite the fact that it had a vastly Muslim majority population. All of these places raised the wrong flag because the border is only announced 3 days later. They all raise the wrong flag on Independence Day, assuming that they're going to join the other country, and then have to pull it down and put up a different flag. So Murshidabad puts out a Pakistani flag and then has to change it to an Indian one. Chittagong Hill Tracts puts up an Indian flag, replaces it with a Pakistani one, and same with Gurdaspur, same with several other districts. There's about kind of 7 instances of this kind of border districts that were given to another country on the basis that it had some important shrine, water resources, basically being able to make the states viable as independent nation states. I think it's important to remember that trying to divide the most religiously syncretic and mixed regions on the planet meant that there was no kind of particular line that would have ever, sort of not done this. But certainly Gurdaspur was given, we know quite explicitly, there were orders to make sure that Gurdaspur went to India because there were 2 roads out of Kashmir. One went through Gurdaspur and one was the kind of, Srinagar highway road that we have running through this city. And both countries needed access to Kashmir so that the Kashmiris themselves supposedly would be allowed to choose which country to join. But yeah, thanks for the question. I think we have time for
yes.
How much time? Yes, hello.
Hello.
As much time as you can.
Yeah, okay. We've got okay. We're good on time.
Brilliant lecture, Sam. Would you like to shed some light on the partition of Punjab, and particularly Jinnah's negotiation with Kartar Singh, Baldev Singh, and Tara Singh, and eventual breakdown of the talks, and ending up with the dissatisfaction of the Sikh with India too? So please.
So that's a topic that I'm afraid the book doesn't go into in very much detail, and I wouldn't be qualified, I think, to kind of comment on that one because it's something that came up in the research, but just because of the breadth of the book, I didn't get a chance to go into in depth. What is certainly the case is that of course, the Muslim League had been demanding Punjab as a whole as a Muslim majority province, but because of its religiously mixed nature and the fact that the Hindu and Sikh populations were particularly in the east near to India, there was a series of alliances that kind of break down. But yeah, the individual state politics of Punjab isn't something that I'm afraid I've gone into enough to comment properly. My apologies. Any more questions? Yes, hello. So over here, can we have the microphone to the front over here, please? Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello.
I wanted to know what is the basis for the title of your book, and does this suggest that would have been better unified, or was it a shattering? Number two, a small one, you mentioned there was a violence in the Punjab because the Punjabi soldiers had been demobilized and there were a lot of weapons. Do demobilized soldiers keep their weapons? I don't understand that.
Both brilliant questions. So the title Shattered Lands, I don't think that it would have been better as a unified nation. You know, like this is a land that stretches from Yemen to Burma, and I don't think that there is a world in which that would have, you know, remained as one single unit. What I do think is that the situation that we have now is a great tragedy. The fact that, you know, what is essentially kind of, one of the most cosmopolitan and mixed regions of the world, which had some of the most syncretic practices and kind of, you know, joint systems, today has the only wall more visible from space than the Great Wall of China. And that, you know, it takes Indians and Pakistanis to meet in the UK or Dubai or the US in order to speak with one another, rather than me being able to sit here with my Indian colleagues on this stage. It's virtually impossible for people to get visas. I don't think that this current situation is tenable. That doesn't mean that, you know, the creation of these states wasn't in some way justified, but it does mean that the violence enacted and the destruction of the relationships and the shattering of communities isn't a great tragedy. So it came from this idea of the shattering of community. And yeah, so that's my answer to that one. Thank you. Remind me the second question you asked. Demobilized soldiers, yes. So interesting one. Yes, so soldiers didn't keep their weapons necessarily, but a lot of them sort of mysteriously, with the way that things were going, didn't hand them back over to the government. And there are all sorts of reports that you get in the archive of kind of, you know, mysterious numbers of weapons going missing, and there's very clearly a massive kind of black market for weapons that's particularly in Punjab. Also, to a lesser extent in Kolkata, in the lead up to Direct Action Day, but a much smaller extent. There are also, you know, a lot of there are all these battlegrounds in Nagaland and Northeast India where, you know, there were just guns lying around on the ground. All of these great battles had been taking place on the Burma front, and there was this huge amount of stuff that kind of people were picking up and selling. And then, of course, finally you have the INA, the Indian National Army, Subhash Chandra Bose, and that whole story, the Japan-aligned anti-British army made up of Indians and Pakistanis, among the Rishis, who formed an anti-British army during World War II. A lot of them basically managed to avoid being caught and managed to smuggle their weapons into India. And a lot of the events actually in 1946 and 7 are often credited to demobilized INA leaders. And in particular, for example, the Lashkar that is sponsored to go into Kashmir has several major INA leaders in it. In addition to that, there's an extraordinary fact that again is increasingly coming out in the scholarship, that I think so often we talk about partition as, oh, our neighbors turned on us overnight, and, you know, neighbor turned on neighbor. And that seems to have been far less common than a lot of earlier scholarship talked about. Far more common was people talking about, you know, a mob coming from outside the village and breaking up a piece that had earlier been there. A lot of this seems to have been these paramilitary groups like the RSS, the Muslim League National Guards, the Khaksars, all of these groups. There were hundreds of them. I can't name them all. But there are a lot of these kind of community defense groups that had been kind of secretly gathering weapons or finding things on the black market, and they were, at least at the beginning, responsible for a huge amount of the violence, particularly in Punjab, particularly in Rawalpindi district here. You often hear when the Rawalpindi massacres take place, they all talk about the fact that it was all basically organized by soldiers on military lines. It was militarily organized with, you know, Muslim soldiers fighting Sikh soldiers as if it was the war. And there's one British officer who says that they had far more difficulty getting from East Punjab to West Punjab and fighting their way through past armored battalions than they had fighting across Nazi Germany during World War II. And so I think that the role of demobilized soldiers is one that's becoming like increasingly highlighted as, again, new documents are being made available to the public. I think this is there's so much new material that has been made available to scholars just in the last decade or two. And in particular, as we all know, archives themselves have been divided across the kind of subsequent nation states. There's some archives in Bangladesh, some in Pakistan, some in India, some in the British Library, some in Yemen, some in Qatar, etc. And one of the big changes in the last decade or so is the fact that increasingly these are going online. They're being digitized. Suddenly you're getting Pakistani scholars being able to access the Indian archives. Suddenly you're getting, for example, the Qatar Digital Library is one of now the greatest digital libraries on planet Earth. And they, in particular, have been digitizing any country's archives to do with basically the Bombay presidency and the Gulf and Sindh and Balochistan. And so if anyone wants to research colonial Balochistan or Sindh, go on the Qatar Digital Library. It's absolutely extraordinary. It has a huge amount of documents that just have never been made available to the public before. But yeah, thank you. I think there's a man sitting down in the middle here. It's also, before we go any further, there seems to, so the books that were meant to be arriving today seem to have somehow got lost in transit, but the book is going to be in Said Bookstore and various other bookstores in Islamabad Market. So I will be signing books here for anyone who's got them already. We're so sorry that we don't have more to sell now, but they will be in Islamabad, and I'm very sorry for that. So yeah, just quick caveat before going any further. Hello.
Hello, thank you. And that's a shame because I was looking forward to getting the book today, but I'll get it when it comes in.
Speaking at anyone's in Lahore for Lahore Lit Fest, I'll also be doing a lot of signings there, and in Karachi Lit Festival. So yeah, off there next.
All right. My question is more like, since we've talked about the more big picture political stuff, I was wondering more about the psychological landscape of the people. Like, we talked about like soldiers fighting each other, their comrades, and we've talked about sectarian violence happening in Bengal and Punjab. So what I'm wondering more is, for example, the received wisdom that I've heard is, like, for example, a lot of the Punjabi massacres happened because the soldiers were themselves trying to conduct an ethnic cleansing before the line was solidified, the Radcliffe line was solidified. So their district would go to the country that they wanted to go to what they were affiliated with. So my question is more like, what motivated these massacres psychologically, if that's something you could go into?
Difficult question.
Yeah, I know. Like, I think like there's no clear answer.
There's no clear answer, and there are a range of things. For some it was being radicalized by the events. I think there's a very clear thing that is particularly pertinent to today in the world of social media, that increasingly news fractured along community lines, so that kind of certain newspapers only reported the deaths of Hindus, certain newspapers only reported the deaths of Muslims, and so that for huge numbers of communities, it wasn't clear that the ethnic cleansing was mutual until much later. And so, the way that news fractures along community lines, just in the same way that our algorithms now give us all the stuff that we want to hear and nothing else. It's a kind of dangerous portent for all that. There are people who were kind of genuinely radicalized. There were some people who were trying to, actively ethnically cleanse. And then there are people, I think one of the best scholars on this is Urvashi Patalia, whose incredible book, Other Side of Silence, is a classic on sort of women's history of partition. She interviews a man who says that, I can't explain it. One day we all went mad. We all just got up, went to the neighboring village and massacred everyone we could. And I've lived with this remorse and nightmares ever since of what we did. And so, there is, to a large extent, this kind of madness, this hysteria that spread. And then there's also, I think, again, the fact that it begins very clearly with self-defense groups, right? Trying to defend their neighborhood. And the fact that the tinderbox seems to have been sparked by a bunch of hungry people trying to break into a food bank, I think tells you everything. That this kind of misunderstanding, this paranoia that was going around at the time, the way that newspapers were saying to that there was a newspaper, I think an issue of Dawn had the title kind of "The Imminent Rape of the Muslim Nation," and then in article, it's Hindi newspapers was saying having whole articles on the medieval desecration of Hindu temple sites by Mahmud of Ghazni, and reminding people what would happen if the Muslims took control and all this kind of stuff. So there's a huge amount of terrifying fear that was going around in a quite real way. At the same time, one of my best friends, Sparsha's grandfather, very clearly remembers that he was living in a small village called Bela near Jhang, small, Hindu family living very happily. They the guy neighboring who was a Muslim, they called their brother, despite the fact that they had no blood relation. They lived this kind of, very happy life. And he's very certain that his family had never heard of the Pakistan demand or the demand for India, really, until one day a mob showed up and were just seeking to kill all the Hindus. And he's very certain that, in this specific valley, they'd never heard of these debates, which hadn't filtered down there. But then suddenly this mob shows up on a killing spree. And so I think, again, we forget how many particularly kind of, rural or rural people had remained completely outside of these national debates, and by focusing only on what Jinnah, Nehru, Gandhi and Mountbatten are debating in the halls of Lutyens Delhi or in kind of, in central Karachi or wherever, we are missing how little this means to huge numbers of people until suddenly the violence gripped hold of the province. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think we've got time for two more because I'm also going to have to then rush off. Hello. Okay, can we get the... Okay, here first, and then this lady here, and then I'm going to have to wrap up. Hello.
Tiny question.
Yes.
So can I?
Yes.
Yes. So this is like coming down to the mundane.
Huh.
I'm a bit curious about the logistics. Of course, you can come across because you may have a foreign passport and your visa may have been issued. I'm just wondering about the number of books you brought in, because India and Pakistan, we cannot import among ourselves books. For 3 huge festivals with this huge book, how did you manage?
Good question. So it's crucially, I could not sell the Indian edition. So the book is published separately in several different areas. So there's a UK edition, there is a US edition, which is about to be published next week, and then there is an India edition. The India issued it to kind of Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, all these other countries across basically much of Asia. Pakistan, we've had to get in the UK edition. So what you've got here is the UK edition that had to be shipped from London. And I wasn't able to, because there is so okay, there we go. How did you get hold of that one?
One of my friends actually sent it, took it with him to LA from Delhi.
Here we go. But yeah, so it's very, very difficult is the answer, and hence, I mean, so the books, so they've been in Liberty, etc., and readings and all of these things for a while now, I think. But the big shipment that was coming for all these festivals now, ThinkFest, LLF, KLF, and then this event here, there was a kind of wonderful situation where it all got stuck in customs in the Gulf somewhere for a bit, and hence why it's kind of been a bit delayed, and I think why it's not here right now. So it is in all the bookshops, but the ones that, so I think it is going to be there in time for, I think it's finally reached Karachi, and it's got through the port, but I think a lot of them are kind of now still making their way to Islamabad. But yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Hello. Last question, and then I will be doing a signing. I don't have a pen, so if anyone from the team can find a pen. Here we go. Thank you. But yeah, hello.
Hi. Oh gosh, I'm really loud. Many congratulations on your book. It's an absolutely fascinating read. I would highly recommend everyone buy it and get it signed at this opportunity. Thank you, Dr. Hoodboy, for organizing such a fantastic talk. So my question is this, with regards to your book. You write in detail about the fragmentation of the British Indian Empire. I wonder if you might like to share your insights on the stability of the modern current South Asian nation states. Which one is most likely to fragment next, if at all?
Good final question. So, everyone, I think there's all sorts of discussions that you hear in the news about kind of all of these countries are on the verge of fragmentation. I don't buy that, but I think that there are very clearly 2 countries out of the ones that have emerged which could very imminently split, and I think they're Yemen and Myanmar. So Yemen, just recently, the South Yemen announced its intention to secede. That announcement. So Yemen, the bits that formerly were part of the British Indian Empire later unified with a country called North Yemen that had emerged from the Ottoman Empire and created the country of Yemen in the 1990s. Interestingly, South Yemen, along the exact borders of the old British Ottoman divide, essentially the old princely state borders, may fragment within our lifetime. There's all sorts of politics. It's impossible to tell. But the fact that this announcement was made this year that the South was intending to secede tells you something. I also think Myanmar, since the coup, since Aung San Suu Kyi's been arrested yet again, since the kind of, everything's got really bad. It's a gorgeous country. And I think, like Yemen, it's the country that I was able to do the least on-ground research that I was hoping to do. There are all sorts of places that I would have loved to visit, particularly along the Myanmar-Bangladesh border, that were just kind of, are not under the control of the government right now. And I'd say about, over half of Myanmar is not currently ruled by the Myanmar government. And you could very easily imagine, right now, it is essentially de facto independent, although the military junta still controls, huge numbers of major cities along particularly the Irrawaddy Valley. It essentially is de facto independent, and within, were China to decide that it wanted an independent North Burma and that would, I could imagine that happening. So there's all sorts of possibilities. I think these two very much could emerge, but of course, it's very rare that new countries emerge these days, but you never know. Greenland and maybe the US very soon, and a lot may change in the next decade, we don't know. And so on that note, thank you ladies and gentlemen for coming.